In January of 1961, a massive B-52 bomber crashed in rural eastern North Carolina. Now, a plane crash is never good, but this plane was carrying something particularly dangerous: 2 nuclear bombs.
These were pretty powerful. These were orders of magnitude more powerful than the 2 that we dropped on Japan in World War II.
Of course, North Carolina did not blow up that night, thankfully, but we came incredibly close.
At the end of the day, luck is the reason that this particular weapon did not go off.
But why were these bombs flying over North Carolina in the first place? And what does this near-nuclear disaster mean for us today?
It's a little unnerving, I suppose, for some people to think that there's part of a nuclear weapon under the ground in North Carolina.
I'm Anissa Khalifa. This is The Broadside, where we tell stories from our home at the crossroads of the South. This week, the Goldsboro Broken Arrow: how a close call during the Cold War could have changed the world.
You come to the New Yorker Radio Hour for conversations that go deeper with people you really want to hear from, whether it's Bruce Springsteen or Questlove or Olivia Rodrigo, Liz Cheney, or the godfather of artificial intelligence, Geoffrey Hinton, or some of my extraordinarily well-informed colleagues at The New Yorker. So join us every week on the New Yorker Radio Hour, wherever you listen to podcasts.
For as long as he can remember, Jay Price has known the story of the 2 nuclear bombs that fell out of the sky near Goldsboro, North Carolina.
I knew about this from childhood, and it would have been part of that kind of milieu, that kind of like dark underpinning to the time that was always in the back of your mind.
Jay is the Military and Veterans Affairs reporter for WUNC. He's also a North Carolina native.
This accident happened just a few months before I was born, but my mother was from Goldsboro, so it loomed large in a period when there were a lot of things to do with the Cold War going on and kind of the dire threat that we felt like we faced. It was strange times.
Let's go back to those strange times, specifically one evening in 1961. A crew of airmen were headed out over the Atlantic, flying a huge B-52. The plane had taken off from Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in Goldsboro, carrying 10 passengers, 8 crew members, and 2, let's say, special guests.
Yeah, the 2 bombs aboard were what were called Mark 39s. These were hugely powerful weapons. They had the explosive force of nearly 4 million tons of TNT each.
So what was this plane doing, flying over American soil, fully equipped with a nuclear payload?
They were part of a kind of ongoing mission for what became known as Chromedome, this kind of effort to keep nuclear weapons in aircraft constantly in the air, ready to attack if we were attacked.
The plane was one of several during this era that was assigned to stay in the air at all times, just in case something went down. And every one of these planes had nuclear bombs on board.
It seems crazy now, this kind of program of keeping these aircraft in the air 24 hours a day with nuclear weapons aboard.
But this was 1961, at the height of the Cold War. Paranoia about a nuclear attack was inescapable.
Military personnel quickly empty out of the sprawling Pentagon, while at the same time, State Department employees leave their desks to join in the realistic rehearsal for an atomic assault.
Sundays, holidays, vacation time, we must be ready every day, all the time, to do the right thing if the atomic bomb explodes. Duck and cover. That's the first thing to do. Duck and cover. First, you duck.
On that chilly January night, the B-52 was flying along, just as its mission dictated. But after a while, the plane needed to refuel.
Someone on the refueling tanker noticed that there was fuel leaking from one of the wings. tanks were typically in the wings, and the leak got worse and worse.
So the crew was ordered to turn around and head back to their base. The plane was almost back to Goldsboro when...
Eventually, the wing apparently just ripped off entirely. The pilots lost control of the aircraft and ordered everybody to bail out. And the plane was just ripped into chunks.
5 of the 8 crew members were able to escape the crash and parachute safely to the ground. But what about those bombs on board?
In the process of the aircraft coming apart in the air, the bombs came loose. They were just part of the debris flying through the air.
When it falls out of the plane and those particular safing pins are pulled, as far as it's concerned, it's on a mission. It's on a mission to go and destroy something. It doesn't know any better.
That's Stephen Schwartz. He's an independent nuclear weapons expert.
It's going through a sequence of events, and because those pins were the first thing that went, everything else starts up.
One of the bombs crashed hard into the ground. It had gotten partway through the detonation process, but it didn't explode.
And I think burrowed something like 50 or 60 feet into swampland, into farmland.
The other bomb came even closer to disaster. Its parachute had launched in the air, so it had plenty of time to activate during its fall.
When it smashes into the ground, the trigger switch in the nose sends a signal to the other circuits like, hey, it's time to explode, but only because the pilot hadn't turned safe switch to ready, because of course this was an accident. They weren't intending to drop nuclear bombs that day. Just because of that and the fact that this one switch worked the way that it was supposed to, that bomb did not go off.
Oh my God, so just that one tiny step
Right.
that didn't happen.
And I should point out that weapons engineers at Sandia National Laboratories, in discussing this accident, have pointed out that that particular switch, the one that worked, quote unquote, had failed 30 separate times in previous accidents. So it's sheer luck. It's sheer luck that it did not fail that particular day. You know, it's like, oh, except for this one switch, you know, we wouldn't be here.
These thermonuclear bombs were far more dangerous than the ones the United States dropped on Japan in World War II. If this one switch hadn't worked, and if the bomb had gone off, it would have destroyed much of eastern North Carolina. But Stephen Schwartz says the damage would have likely extended well beyond.
U.S. history and world history would have been almost certainly dramatically altered by the destruction of a large portion of North Carolina and the resulting radioactive contamination of a large portion, depending on where the wind was blowing that day, of the East Coast, possibly including Washington, D.C.
On top of that, it could have been the domino that tipped the U.S. into a full-blown nuclear war.
In the midst of a crisis with the Soviet Union, where we were on heightened alert and we were worried about them attacking us, and then all of a sudden there's a nuclear explosion and nobody's quite sure what happened, right? Because everybody that would have known about it is now dead. So there's this mushroom cloud blossoming up over North Carolina. Do we take the time to find out what's going on? Or do we launch an attack because we think that we are under attack?
Now, all of that is a big and scary what if. But there was still a very real and serious hazard to consider. The first bomb that crashed into the ground wasn't completely harmless. Here's Jay Price again.
The other one buried itself in the ground, and the digging for the parts went on and on and on, and they never really recovered all of it.
It was essentially a swamp. The Air Force had a very energetic effort to try to recover all the parts of that weapon, which was made complicated by the fact that it was freezing cold because it was January, and also because of this being a swamp, water kept inundating the hole that they were digging to try to get this thing out.
They did find parts of the trigger, parts of the detonation mechanism and so forth, and got that out.
So they got the atomic part out. The hydrogen part is stuck in the ground somewhere. They couldn't get it. They tried and tried and tried. They eventually gave up. It was less expensive to ask the Atomic Energy Commission to supply a new weapon, but they put an easement around the land. They put a sign up and said, you can't dig here forever.
Because of that, parts of a nuclear bomb are still in the ground just outside Goldsboro. It's something Stephen Schwartz says we'll just have to live with.
It's a little unnerving, I suppose, for some people to think that there's part of a nuclear weapon under the ground in North Carolina, but it doesn't really pose any explosion risk.
Y'all, I've lived in North Carolina for many years, but I had never heard about this story. I was floored when I learned just how close we came to a world-changing catastrophe. And this might have been one of the closer calls during the Cold War, but it was far from the only time the U.S. had a mishap with its nuclear weapons.
This accident is absolutely not unique.
That's coming up after a short break. A few years ago, Jay Price traveled down to South Carolina. He was on a reporting trip, looking for a big hole.
You can't really call it a tourist attraction, but people do still go there to have a look at it. It's in the woods.
And sure enough, off the beaten path, he found it. It's a site of another blunder with a bomb, when the Air Force accidentally dropped a nuclear weapon just outside of Florence in the late 1950s.
The pit that it created when it blew up, the kind of conventional munitions that are used as part of the triggering for that one actually detonated and substantially damaged a house nearby beyond repair and injured several people in the same family. It was a pretty hefty blast. It created a pit that was about 30-some feet deep.
Incidents like the ones in Goldsboro and Florence were more common than you might think. The military calls these mishaps broken arrows. It's shorthand for accidents that could cause a nuclear weapon to detonate.
And therefore, it's obviously something that you want to avoid.
Nuclear weapons expert Stephen Schwartz says the Pentagon has officially acknowledged 32 broken arrows.
But they're not the only accidents. There have been literally thousands of other accidents involving U.S. nuclear weapons from the 1940s and 50s up to the present day.
One thing that helps explain why there's been so many accidents is the size of the United States nuclear arsenal. It was massive.
In 1961, we had 22,229 operational nuclear weapons around the world. We were building nuclear weapons. At that year, we manufactured about 14 a day, which sounds incredible until you realize that the year before, we'd built nearly 22 a day.
If you're cranking out all those nuclear bombs and building up that inventory, just statistically, something's bound to go wrong every now and then.
So we were coming off of the late 1950s and early 60s were the greatest expansion of the nuclear arsenal in our history. Unfortunately, the military realized by 1967 that it had gone overboard. It had more nuclear weapons than it knew what to do with. We didn't know what to do with all these weapons. We were bombing sheep and cow pastures in Soviet republics that could potentially be used as backup landing strips for Soviet bombers during nuclear war because we just had all these weapons and they had to go somewhere.
This is so fascinating. That's like shocking to me because this is a time when children are having to do like nuclear safety drills, right? I mean, people are thinking about this all the time. There's like a real fear of the possibility of, nuclear annihilation. So did the public know and understand that the Air Force was putting these bombs on planes for this Operation Chromedome and flying over them?
The Air Force wasn't always completely honest with the public about the nature of these accidents. The Air Force was very cagey about the risks. I think they understood all too well that if you gave out too much information, people who were otherwise supportive of nuclear weapons and national defense measures might say, this sounds a little risky to me. I'm all in favor of, safeguarding the United States, but you've got nuclear weapons flying over my house. I'm not sure I'm very comfortable with that. Well, the way that you abort a conversation is to not even tell people that you're doing that. But of course, when there's an accident, it's unavoidable.
How about with the Goldsboro accident specifically?
In this case, they did acknowledge that 2 bombs fell out of the plane. They said that they were dropped safely. which is an interesting way to put it. And they said that the wreckage had been recovered and that there was, no cause for concern, which was pretty much standard operating procedure for the Air Force. But, this was in the context of a lot of other things going on. I think people in general had more trust of the government then than they do now. So when the Air Force says there's no reason to be concerned, why should I be concerned, right? Or if there's a reason to be concerned, well, it's all for the greater good of making sure that we don't blow up in a nuclear war. But I think mostly, people tried not to think about nuclear weapons and nuclear war all that much. It was probably harder for school children going through those duck and cover drills in their classrooms to be confronted with that all the time. I think, we're just able to kind of partition our lives. And if it doesn't impact us directly and the government says, there's nothing to see here, move along, you moved on.
Eventually, the Air Force moved along as well. In 1968, Operation Chromedome, the project that kept these planes carrying nuclear bombs in the air 24 hours a day, came to a halt.
There was a spectacular crash over Greenland in January 1968, which actually put an end to the airborne alert program. They'd finally realized that they'd had, after almost a decade of airborne alerts with numerous accidents on the ground and in the air, that it was time to put a stop to it.
So do we have more nuclear weapons now than we did at the height of the Cold War?
No, fortunately, that is one of the most important things that we don't have. But I think there's a danger in not acknowledging that these things happen because you get potentially cocky about what the risks are. And if you're the public, you don't realize how dangerous all of this actually was, not just during the Cold War, but today. If you don't understand that there were all of these very, very serious accidents and that we still run very serious risks with our nuclear weapons today, sure, we're not flying them around on planes on a regular basis, but that doesn't mean that there's not a risk of an accident. Every single one of these accidents has something remarkable and remarkably scary about it. It's a matter of luck in a lot of these cases, and luck only goes so far,
Stephen Schwartz is the author of Atomic Audit, The Costs and Consequences of U.S. Nuclear Weapons Since 1940. If you'd like to check out more of Jay Price's reporting on the Goldsboro Broken Arrow incident, including photos, you can click the link in the show notes. This episode of The Broadside was produced by Charlie Shelton Ormond. It was edited by Jared Walker. Wilson Sayre is our executive producer. The Broadside is a production of WUNC North Carolina Public Radio and is part of the NPR network. You can email us at broadside@wunc.org. If you enjoyed the show, leave us a rating, a review, or share it with a friend. I'm Anissa Khalifa. Thanks for listening, y'all. We'll be back next week.